at a conference on technology and Judaism, which is actually very appropriate since we're on a Zoom. And let me see if I can raise this or maybe lower myself, one of the two. I did not realize, hold on, don't go anywhere. I'm just going to get a book to prop this up. Here we go, this might help. Anyway, so welcome to this class, which really is an attempt to explore how we think about Shavuot in a time when, after all, we're having a very difficult time, just in general, about being in the world, because if you remember, when Revelation first happened, it's not like the Jews were in such great shape. So it is certainly not a new thing for us to be subject to difficulties at a time that we think about and talk about the revelation from Sinai. And I think today it has a special resonance, and I want to talk about two different aspects of it, about Revelation, and also I think about the central text that we all think of when we think about Shavuot, not so much the book of Ruth, but the Ten Commandments, because we do read the book of Ruth, of course, on Shavuot, which makes it a beautiful time, and we often, at Sinai and elsewhere, of course, have B'nai Mitzvah, conversions, so on, centered around this time of the year. But I want to start with just the idea of revelation and the notion, which is really so not just central but repeated in Judaism, that the moment of peak understanding and goodness and so on is preceded by pain and suffering and difficulty. You know that Isaiah Berlin, as you know, Isaiah Berlin made this famous distinction between freedom from and freedom to. Freedom from slavery, but also freedom to stand at Sinai. And the standing at Sinai was only possible, I think, because in some ways the people have been tempered by slavery to understand that it was impossible to live without some kind of regulation, but at the same time, being servants to God is a different order of existence from being servants to Pharaoh. In part, I think about this because the time that we're in is a difficult time in a very different way. And what the Jewish people struggled with was in ancient times was not just the condition of slavery and liberation, but also the creation of peoplehood. Because as they left Egypt, remember that, you know, it is not necessarily true that slaves feel a kinship with one another. They may feel a kinship with each other's situations, but slavery creates divisions just as it creates unity. And so part of the job of Moshe and the wandering in the desert was not just to create an attachment to God, but for Israel to create an attachment to one another. And Ahavat Yisrael, the love of Israel as the people Israel, was a central part of the journey through the wilderness and the story of the Torah. And that actually is a big part of our struggle today. The students at the encampments, for example, were not lacking in idealism or lacking in intellect or lacking in other virtues that we might think of as in some way essential to the Jewish people or to a Jewish community. What they were lacking in some sense, was Ahavat Yisrael. They did not feel a natural and deep kinship to the people Israel. And this, especially for a small people, is indispensable for Jews to be able to remain Jews. And Shavuot reminds us, and in this sense, of course, the book of Ruth does very much tie into this, reminds us how central peoplehood is to the moment of revelation. Because you'll recall what Ruth says when she decides to become a Jew. She doesn't say, oh, I like your theology. She says, your people will be my people. And then she goes on to say, your God will be my God. But peoplehood precedes theology for Ruth. And weirdly, around the mountain of Sinai, it was first the people had to gather around the mountain before the theology could then rain down. So I think that this Shavuot is really a Shavuot in which the Jewish people have to renew, reevaluate, rethink the idea of peoplehood, which has always been important to us, but has a special importance in our day. And the thing that I wanted to say about the Ten Commandments was that the purpose of the Ten Commandments is, I mean, a purpose. There's more than one, obviously, get people to stop killing each other and stealing and so on. But apart from that, which is certainly a worthy purpose of the Ten Commandments, but the other part of it was to affirm something that was new in the theology of the ancient world. And in order to understand this, we have to go back to, if you've read your Homer or you remember the Odyssey or the Iliad or any of Greek myths, you remember that the gods were not only capricious, not only did they act very, very willfully and on whim, but also the gods would treat human beings based on entirely how human beings treated the gods. That was the only measure of morality in terms of, it wasn't even morality, it was the only measure of reciprocity, was if people treated gods well, if they made the right sacrifice, if somehow the gods fell in love with them or whatever, then they would be good. But the Ten Commandments begins that way. It starts with, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, all the stuff that you would expect, but then it switches. And it says, by the way, respect your parents, don't steal, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't, on and on, which is a way of saying how you treat human beings is of ultimate concern to God. And that's so natural for us in the modern world that we don't realize what a radical innovation that is in the history of religion and values. Because in the ancient world, the gods didn't care how you treated each other. That wasn't an issue. I mean, remember the idea that, for example, the weak and the poor and the widow and the orphan should be taken care of was an idea that seemed to most ancient societies as just ludicrous and unnecessary. And the whole point of power was that it showed you were favored by the gods. And if you didn't have power, that showed you were disfavored by the gods. And then along comes Judaism, which from the Ten Commandments onward says, no, that's not actually the way we evaluate the worth of a person or of a people, because your success in the world is not a measure alone of the favor of God. And that in fact, how you treat each other is how God measures you. And so the Ten Commandments are a sort of continuation of this fundamental Jewish idea that starts, of course, at the very beginning of Bereshit, of Genesis, by telling people you're in God's image, which again was a radical change from the ancient world, where the idea that every human being had some fundamental equality did not exist. And there was no reason for it to exist. Species similarity hardly makes someone morally the same unless there's a reason to think they're morally the same. So if we think about the Shalosh Regalim, the three holidays, Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot, I think we can think of them this way. Passover, and let me just say at the beginning, all of them have multiple themes. It's not as though a holiday only instantiates one idea or another idea and that's it, right? There's an agricultural piece to it, there's a historical piece to it, there's a theological piece to it, on and on and on and on. So this is hardly comprehensive. This is just going to be one slice of the approach that one could take to these three festivals. Passover is essentially about freedom. Begins in slavery, ends in freedom. What you do with freedom, how you shape freedom, what freedom means, what it doesn't mean, the extent to which the human soul can withstand freedom, rebels against freedom, because the Jews do rebel against it, on and on and on, all those things. Sukkot is really, in some sense, about temporality, fragility, the recognition that there is something greater above us, the acceptance of the idea that what human beings create and what they are is kitzel over, like a passing shadow. And then you come to Shavuot, which is really about understanding. Because it is the holiday on which we stay up late and study. And that's because understanding the Torah and understanding the reality of God's demands on us, expectations on us, and our expectations on one another is what the entire purpose of the Torah is devoted to. The ways in which we help each other, disappoint each other, gather together in community, miss each other in community. All of that is really the theme of Shavuot. And I know that in previous classes that we've had, I was told that one thing that people wanted was a chance to have more time for interchange and questions. And so I'm going to ask you, please, I don't know how we're doing this, whether we're putting them in the chat or somebody can come on the Zoom. I have no idea.
Yes, we can just send all the questions in the chat here and I will follow up. But
please do ask questions, because I'm more than happy to, I didn't prepare an hour lecture, and I am more than happy to answer any questions about, not only about Shavuot, but about anything that PSA chat is disabled. That's what I was just told. Although how someone put that in the chat, I don't know. They put it in the Q&A and said chat is disabled.
Q&A is open for everyone.
Q&A is open for everyone. Okay, so I have the Q&A open on my screen. So if you put something in the screen, I hope, God willing, I will see it and try to be able to answer. And you can ask questions about anything. You can ask about Shavuot. You can ask about other things if you want. I am more than happy to answer. Because as I said, the one thing that I heard was in previous classes, I didn't leave enough time for questions. So fire away. While you are gearing up, I will tell you that we just had a whole session at this conference on the possibility of the metaverse, which is a remarkable and a somewhat frightening possibility that we would actually live in a sort of virtual reality much of the time, and what that would do for Judaism and the way in which Judaism could or could not take advantage of that. How can we avoid a point of no return regarding anti-Semitism in America? Okay, we can do anti-Semitism. What are your thoughts on taking a new name? And the encampments. Were you consciously giving those identifying as Jews the benefit of the doubt in terms of sincerity fitting in? Okay, so let me do anti-Semitism and encampments. In terms of taking a new name, my thoughts are, if it pleases you, do it. There are superstitious reasons for taking a new name as though it's going to fool the angel of death. I'm not so sure, but it certainly sometimes can feel like an act of rebirth or at least something that you can do. So I am entirely in favor of it. If you choose to take a new name, I have no problem with that. Let me say something about the encampments because that's more specific, and then about anti-Semitism in general. And of course, there is a lot to say. And those of you who are really interested in the history of anti-Semitism and how we got to where we are, I have a lecture online at YouTube. You can look up Wolpe anti-Semitism or Wolpe Emmanuel or Wolpe Stryker Center, and you'll see the lecture. So let me start with the encampments. So there isn't one type of student at the encampments among the Jewish students, and also realize that social media deeply divides and radicalizes people. And that we know, in fact, from lots of surveys that even people who express themselves on social media, if you ask them the same question in person, they will often give you different answers. And what that means is what you do performatively and how you feel individually can be different. And what you do in order to fit in with your peers and what you do when you are separate from your peers can be different. So some of the people who were at the encampment were there performatively. Some of them were there naively. Some of them will be embarrassed in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years that they were there. Some of them deeply believe what they believe and have entirely bought into the narrative of Israel as a colonial settler state, oppressing the Palestinians from even before it became a state. And I think that those people suffer not from some of them, I mean, obviously, some of them don't have any information, right? I assume many of you saw that article in the Wall Street Journal, From the River to the Sea, where they didn't know which river and which sea. But some of them suffer not from a lack of information, which is a mistake that we too often make. We say, oh, if only they knew the facts. No, it's not true. What they suffer from, I think, is a misshaped perspective. They don't see the world the way that people see it, who have a little more, I think, experience of the realities of history and feel it in their bones. Their reality is shaped much more by what they've seen on social media. And we know, for example, that especially on TikTok, you saw more pro-Palestinian imagery on TikTok in terms of sheer numbers than you saw images of any kind on all the major news networks. It was a cascade of information that proved negative towards Israel and towards the Jewish people. And so that's one piece of it. And then the other piece of it that is, I think, worth recognizing is that when you say that people want to fit in with their peers, it's not that they think to themselves, I really disagree, but I want to fit in. Social pressure doesn't work that way. I mean, sometimes it does, right? You say, oh, I don't really believe this, but I'm going to pretend to believe it because that will let them like me. But generally what happens is it actually shapes your views. That is, you become acculturated to the views of your contemporaries such that you can't separate out what you might otherwise believe from what you actually believe, given the fact that all your contemporaries believe it. So the only way really to change that is to separate people from the environment and the atmosphere that they're in. One of the most important things, I mean, among many important things that the Jewish community has to do, is to continue to run trips to Israel and to have kids go to Israel. That's enormously important. And also to have communities where Jewish and pro-Israeli views can be supported. What we must not do is write these people out of the Jewish community, in part because, as Fareed Zakaria said in an interview where he talked very, very sympathetically, by the way, about Israel and Israel's concerns, he said, you know, when I was at Harvard, people were writing editorials in favor of Pol Pot. So were they all really genocidal communists, which is what Pol Pot was? No, of course they were. And they grew up to be, you know, doctors and lawyers and hedge fund operatives, runners, whatever you call a hedge fund person. And some of these kids will too. So ideologies do change and shift. We have to keep fighting that fight against. And do I believe that we've reached a point of no return? I deeply don't believe that. Again, anti-Semitism is vastly, vastly overrepresented in the media and online. And you know this because when you look at actual surveys, they're very different from what you would assume when you look online. So for instance, I don't know how many of you saw the Harvard-Harris survey of kids between 18 and 29, and they gave them 16 issues. What is the most important to you? Do you know what the bottom two issues were? The bottom two of 16 were student loans and Israel-Gaza. Those were the bottom two. Whereas if you just looked at the evening news, you would think the only thing that kids care about are student loans and Israel-Gaza. But in fact, the most important ones were inflation and unemployment and healthcare. And in other words, what we think of as sort of conventional concerns, but that's not how it comes across in the media. So most Americans still have a positive view of Israel. Most Americans still have a positive view of Jews. Having said that, do we have serious and important work to do? Of course we do. Has anti-Semitism spiked? No question about it. Is it alarming and worrisome? All those things? Yes, it is. But it is too easy to jump immediately to the worst conclusion without actually taking a step back and looking at the full range of evidence. And the full range of evidence is not quite, I mean, look, so you had anti-Semitism at Stanford, and yet the next person they chose as a president was a Jew. You had anti-Semitism at Harvard, and yet the interim president is not only a Jew, but he's a Jew who has a brother who lives in Israel and is himself, by the way, a member of a conservative shul where he occasionally reads Torah. So it's not so easy to think that, I mean, it's not so wise to use anecdotes and think they're data. If you look at the ADL will tell you clearly how the statistics have jumped. But we have a lot of allies and a lot of friends. Israel still gets an enormous amount of aid from the United States in military and in financial terms, whichever side of the aisle you're on. That has never been a question about the aid that the United States gives to Israel being orders of magnitude greater than it gives to any other country by many, 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 many times. And so we have to really be measured in terms of our reactions, even when people do things that we disagree with or we don't like. The one other thing, I mean, I could talk about anti-Semitism for a long time, I'm really trying, and I advise you to do what nobody wants to do online, which is strike a balance. To understand that there are real concerns, but not, not every disease is the fatal heart attack. And we do not fight our best when we're panicked. We fight our best when we are sober and thoughtful and careful, and we recognize what the real threats are, and we're aware of what the real threats aren't. And the last thing that I will say on this before I go on to the next, because I have several other questions, is the greatest threat to American Judaism is not anti-Semitism. The greatest threat to American Judaism is ignorance and assimilation, as it has long been. Our disappearing ourselves is a much greater threat at the moment than someone else coming along and disappearing us. And so while it is true that anti-Semitism gets most of the ink and most of the attention, without Jewish education, anti-Semitism will have its work done for it, because Jews will disappear on their own because they won't know what it means to be a Jew. Okay. Yes, it is curious and wonderful that the Torah portion this week is about building community and the importance of it. Can Revelation be about joy, or does it only follow difficulty? And how do I feel about the admonition to wipe out one's enemies in the Torah? So first of all, yes, Revelation certainly can be about joy. The Torah, I don't know that the initial revelation could have happened to a people that never knew difficulty. And I still do think that, sadly, the way we are constructed, it is actually through difficulty, through trial, that human beings find their greatest sources of meaning and some of their deepest experiences. But having said that, so you have to look at all the passages about wiping out your enemies very carefully. It depends where they're written, why they're written, and how they're written. And also what it meant to wage war in the ancient world. And while this is not an easy thing for us to think of when we're in a very different world and a much safer one, in the ancient world, again and again and again, what happened was people would, when they conquered a territory, they would make sure that anyone who fought them or could fight them was destroyed, because they did not want to raise a population that would eventually rebel against them. And this was the cruel reality of the world in which people lived. We tend not to realize how much less violent our world is than the world of the ancient. I mean, even in the world of the Middle Ages, right? The most dangerous city in the world now, the most dangerous city in the world, whatever it is half as dangerous as London in the 1500s, which was half as dangerous again as a similar city in the year 50, and now we're talking about places that were 1,000, 1,200, 1,300 years older than that. And that was the way war was waged in the ancient world. The way that it was waged was you attacked your enemy and you wiped out everyone who might ever attack you in response. There were no prisons. In fact, the first people that introduced the thought of exile, of just wholesale scattering people so that they no longer existed, were the Assyrians, who conquered the northern kingdom in 722 and scattered the Jews in the thought that, we'll scatter them and then there won't be Jews anymore. Little did they know, the Assyrians are gone, we're still here. That's, by the way, where you got the 10 lost tribes. So, yeah, I don't think that it's an easy thing for us as moderns to see. But I think that it is also a reminder of the world that we came from and how it operated, as opposed to the way the world is now, which is, thank God, very different, even in the most brutal wars It's nothing like it was. And, last night, I had a debate about AI, a discussion and a debate with Gary Kasparov, the former world chess champion, whom I very much admire, by the way. And we were talking about AI, and we had a moderator, and the moderator said something about Gaza and the war in Gaza. And Kasparov is Russian. He's actually, his mother was an Armenian. His father was Jewish. His father's name was Weinstein. Anyway, Kasparov is an opponent of Putin, and he said, if the Israelis fought like Putin fought, the war would be long over. They just would have bombed all of Gaza. They would have killed all of them, and they'd be done. So even in the modern world, there are people who sometimes wage war like that, if given the opportunity to. Thank God, Israel is not among them. Okay, what is the relationship between hope and agency or advocacy at this time? Chabad and other Orthodox communities say if we put light into the world, it will come back to us. The hostages will be released, etc. But that isn't enough. How do we not lose hope while recognizing that it isn't enough? First of all, I love the idea of putting light out into the world. And I'm all for putting light out into the world. And the more light, the better. I really do not believe that what you put out into the world is necessarily what you get back. Why that is a different question. But all throughout history, we have discovered that sometimes you put goodness into the world and you do not get goodness back. You think that nobody in the Holocaust put goodness out into the world? Of those millions of Jews and Jewish communities all over Europe, they didn't put goodness out into the world. They put enormous goodness out into the world, and what they got back was horror. So yeah, I completely agree with you, Audrey. It is not sufficient to put goodness into the world. By the way, it's necessary, but not sufficient. What you have to put out into the world are a couple of things. First of all, and since we're talking about anti-Semitism, I do want to say this. One of the things you have to put out into the world is genuine friendship, by which I mean, when you see people, as Michael Douglas recently did, who visit Israel, or Seinfeld did, Jerry Seinfeld did, who visit Israel and say good things about Israel and support it, especially, by the way, if they're not Jewish, especially if they're not Jewish. I think the Jewish community has to reach out to them and thank them and praise them. I always tell Jewish audiences, man, if you see somebody who, like Van Jones, who says wonderful things about the Jewish community, you got to reach out and praise him and thank him. And I think that sometimes we are much better at identifying our enemies than we are at embracing our friends. So that's one way to put light out into the world that is really important and effective, is thank the people that stand up for you. Something else that's, I think, helpful and important is not just to put light out, but also to be vigilant. The fact that we are so aware of anti-Semitism is a really good thing and terribly important. And we remember in history, not only obviously the most obvious example of history, but examples before that as well, what it meant when we weren't so vigilant, and what an unimaginable price we paid for people who thought, oh, this will blow over and we don't really have to pay attention to it because it's always blown over in the past. And so I don't want anyone to mistake my relative optimism about the future of Jews in America for naivete or for the idea that we don't have to fight, we don't have to be aware, and we don't have to raise our voices at every instance of anti-Semitism that we see. We certainly do. Absolutely do. That's part of what it means to have a decent self-defense. But then you also have to couple that with putting out light and appreciation. Like, You can't constantly, for example, say, oh, America is done, it's terrible, they just hate Jews. When there are so many Americans of all stripes, right, left, center, black, white, every color, who esteem and support Jews and want to be acknowledged and thanked for that, and not to be made to feel like their efforts don't mean anything. So it is like a lot of things in life, it's a delicate dance. We have to support, we have to defend, we have to praise, we have to embrace. We have to do everything we can. And that's agency and advocacy, I would say, at some point, go together. Hi, I'm not getting any of the easy questions today, because the next one was, at this point, do you think there's any potential outcome in Gaza that can create genuine healing on both sides? So is there any potential outcome that could do that? Absolutely. Is it likely? That's a separate question. But let me at least suggest one or two possibilities that might be somewhat hopeful. One of the things that we're currently dealing with is not just the destruction, but the ideology. Ideology is a very, very potent force, so potent that sometimes it overcomes self-interest. You would think, well, if we just create better living conditions, that would be sufficient, but it is not sufficient. Because actually the ideological extremism of various groups that are involved in Gaza and throughout, for that matter, the Islamic world, make it almost impossible to create the kind of amity that you would hope for. But here is a hopeful sign that has not existed in previous ages when we talked about this, which is that there are countries like the UAE, the Abraham Accord countries, that have managed, in spite of the ideological tendencies of their neighbors, to be able nonetheless to create some kind of joint coalition of interest that is greater than the animosities of ideology. And that's point one for optimism and the possibility of healing. The second is that it is important to remember that even though you would think that hatreds in various communities are generationally unchanging, and that especially after such painful and destructive war, it would not be possible to turn around and create healing. History says otherwise. I'm not speaking specifically of the Middle East, although you did see that with Jordan and with Egypt. Was it still possible to create, after terrible and destructive and awful wars? Yes. But also I'm talking about what we've seen in other historical circumstances, in places as various as Bosnia and Ireland, in World War II, after some really terrible and painful conflicts. People have found a way to grow past the pain that they feel, the losses that they've suffered, and the hatreds that they bear, to create peace. Could that happen in Gaza? Certainly, it could happen. Am I betting on it? Not right now, not today, but it could happen, and I pray that it will, because, you know, one of the things that we, I think, are all aware of is that weapons are not getting less destructive, and they're not getting less widespread. And even, by the way, the one other thing that could happen that would be really helpful is if I could wave a magic wand and make one slight change, I would change the government in Iran. The degree to which Iran foments so much of the unrest in the Middle East is almost not to be believed. But on the second side, you used to be able to say the same thing about Saudi Arabia, and now Saudi Arabia is genuinely interested in creating peace with Israel. So there are many, many, many moving parts in this conflict, and time will tell. I also want to say, just between us, I do not think that Israel's leadership has acquitted itself all that well, both preceding October 7th and subsequent to October 7th. And by that, I just mean, apart from the prosecution of the war, first of all, the fact that October 7th happened is a catastrophic failure of Israel's leadership. That the society was so divided before is a failure of leadership, because there are lots of ways of introducing changes, and not all of them create such tremendous internal rupture. And subsequently, unfortunately, I think Israel, among many, many other things that I am disappointed in terms of the leadership of Israel, I don't see any effective spokesperson from Israel to the world, with almost the solitary exception of Tal Becker when he spoke to the International Criminal Court. But I don't see someone like that explaining to America and to other English-speaking countries the way you would expect. The way, for example, many, many years ago, Netanyahu used to do on Nightline during the Iran crisis and after. What Israel's position is, why it does what it does, and so on. And by the way, if you ask Israelis, no one has effectively done that to the Israeli people either. So there's a lot that Israel could theoretically have done better that would have perhaps a little bit ameliorated the dire PR situation that it finds itself in. So that's also, I think, something that is painful and unfortunate. I mean, for a country that is just stuffed to the gills with articulate and brilliant people who can enunciate in every language, certainly including English. I mean, everyone in Israel speaks English. The fact that they haven't had more effective and constant spokespeople on American media and world media, the fact that Israelis will tell you that the government doesn't speak to them in Hebrew media, that Netanyahu has given, I think, only one interview to Hebrew media since October 7th. That's not okay, and it's not good, and it doesn't help. So when we're involved in such a serious struggle, and I think that the struggle in Gaza is very serious for many, many reasons, you want to be able to explain to the world what you're doing and why you're doing it. It's hard. It's hard. So there you have it. I don't have any other questions written. At least I don't see any other questions. Are there any other questions that I don't want to say I've answered them, but at least I've responded to all the questions that I saw so far. We're about to start the new book of Bamidbar, and our journey through the wilderness, and that's where we are now. And it continues to be a journey. It's not as though we all of a sudden finished, and I'll say that we need healing both from the point of view of Israel, Gaza, but also inside of Israel. The tensions in Israel and as one of the questioners put it, the internal rupturing make it very difficult to be able to sustain a continued and an existential struggle when you know that there are such deep divisions in the society. Whether, by the way, having been in this together, will help, that I don't know. And that's one more conceivable optimistic outcome of this. You know, families have fights, and then all of a sudden someone gets sick. And even after the person recovers, they look at each other sometimes and they say, you know what we were fighting about really doesn't matter considering what we were facing. It is possible that after October 7th and after this is over, whenever this is over, Israel will be able to find its way back to one another a little bit better again. That's my hope. There's no guarantee, but it is certainly possible that that's true. Does prayer work? Yes, but maybe not the way the question is asked. So it depends what you want out of prayer. Does it work to change the world? I am not convinced that, in fact, if someone is sick and you pray for them, they are more likely to be healed, but they are more likely to get strength from it, and that may heal them. If prayer changes who you are, then it works. The idea of prayer is to draw us closer to God, not to make God do what we want. So if you're praying because you think prayer means that God will do what you want, then I'm doubtful that prayer will work. But if prayer means, will I learn better to do what God wants, then I think prayer is incredibly effective. And it also helps us understand ourselves and our world better. So let me close with a couple words about Shavuot, since it is Shavuot. And that is, you know, Shavuot is the end of the Omer, in which we count 50 days from liberation to the mountain of Sinai. And the fundamental message of counting the Omer is that every day counts. That sometimes we look ahead, and in looking ahead, we lose where we are. Right now, with all the problems that the Jewish world has, we are unbelievably blessed. We have a roof over our heads. We have food in our stomachs. We have a state of Israel. And yes, we pray every day for the hostages to come home who are living in unbelievable, awful circumstances. And now we know more of whom have passed away, as painful as it is even to contemplate, while in the captivity of Hamas. But as a whole, as the Jewish people see much worse days than today, again and again and again and again and again, all you need to do is read Jewish history, and you will be astonished by the enormity of the pain and challenges that our ancestors endured and overcame. So I have faith in us. I think we will too. Thank you for joining me. For those of you who have been asking, I moved back to Los Angeles at the end of the month of June. And next year I will be there most of the time. I'll be LA, New York, but most of the time in LA. And I look forward to seeing many of you in person. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Please follow us on our website for more events and high holidays announcements. Thank you, Rabbi David Wolpe.
Thank you.